And now for today's webinar, tips and tools to strengthen participation and engagement in online learning contexts. This webinar will begin with a general overview of different course delivery formats, including MOOCs, blended or hybrid courses, and courses run fully online. The webinar will then provide specific strategies for how to participate in courses of these types and how to make the most out of the learning experience in both online and offline contexts. Also, teachers participating in the webinar will gain skills and knowledge about designing courses in online formats, and you will better understand how to motivate students to participate and engage fully in this type of course. It's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Andy Halverson and Jennifer Rice. Dr. Andy Halverson is currently a faculty member in the American English Institute at the University of Oregon, where he primarily trains pre-service and in-service language teachers in both face-to-face and online contexts. He has a PhD in education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, with a focus on bilingualism and biliteracy development and a research specialization in program evaluation. Andy has been involved in ESL, EFL instruction, teacher training, and curriculum development for over 15 years, and he has worked and taught in the United States, China, Japan, Thailand, and Albania. Andy has given numerous conference presentations around the world, and he has authored a range of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Jennifer Rice is a senior instructor at the American English Institute at the University of Oregon. For the past 5 years, she has been an online teacher trainer for the English for Specific Purposes Effective Practices course, which is part of the Department of State's e-teacher program. Since 2002, Jennifer has taught university learners in Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Her current research involves investigating the needs of undergraduate English language learners in their content area courses, with a special focus on science-related courses. Please welcome Andy and Jennifer.
Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Andy Halverson and I'm here with Jennifer Rice.
Hi everybody, I'll be talking to you later.
Today we're going to talk to you about some tips and tools to strengthen participation and engagement in online learning contexts. But before we get started, I just wanted to mention briefly one of the pre-webinar questions that we asked you. We asked you to share your feelings about online courses, and it looks like about 50% of you have said that online courses are maybe somewhat better than face-to-face courses. So this is really interesting, and this is something we're going to talk more about over the next hour or so. So let me show you our agenda for today, our plan for today. We have 3 parts listed here. You can see in part number 1, we're going to talk about some different course formats: face-to-face, blended and hybrid courses, online courses, and MOOCs. And in part number 2, we'll talk about some tips for choosing and participating in online courses. And then Jennifer will take over for part number 3, and she will talk to you about some tips for strengthening your online teaching skills. And if you're not familiar with something like MOOCs, for example, don't worry. We're going to talk more about that here very shortly. So let's talk just a little bit first about planning for your own learning. I hope that in this course, in this webinar today, you'll be able to do a little bit of work to consider the different course types and also to think about and understand your own motivation as a learner. And then I hope that at the end, we'll be able to think about what type of course might be right for you to participate in. So to get started, I think we need to do a little bit of work to define some terms. It's important that we all have some common language, some common terminology to talk about. So let's go through a few terms that will be important for this webinar. First, face-to-face learning, face-to-face course. This is often abbreviated as F2F. And I think all of you have some experience with a face-to-face course. This is a traditional course, meeting in a classroom, and it's face-to-face between the students and the teachers. A fully online course takes place in the opposite of a face-to-face environment. There's no instructor face-to-face time in a fully online course. All learning takes place through a computer, and all learning happens online. A blended or hybrid course is somewhere in between the two. There'll be some face-to-face learning happening combined with some online learning. And I've had a lot of courses like this as well. Teaching a course at the University of Oregon face-to-face with students who are in front of me, but that's also supplemented with some online learning components as well. This is becoming a very common course type at universities, especially in the United States now. And finally, the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course, with no limit on student numbers. This is a slightly different type of structure from a fully online course because, again, the number of participants, number of students in the course is unlimited. It can be 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. So let me just show you an example of a MOOC if possibly you're not familiar with this. If you've not seen a MOOC before, you can look at this example hosted by Coursera. The U.S. State Department has partnered with the University of Oregon to create the Shaping the Way We Teach English MOOCs. These are offered in a two-part series, and so far, tens of thousands of participants have completed the courses. They're completely free and they're open to everyone. And if you want to learn more about these courses, there's a link to these on our Ning. So now I want to switch over and look at our first poll question, if you don't mind. So the first question we have here, what type of courses have you taken as a student? So I'd like to get some information quickly from you about the types of courses you've participated in. So a face-to-face course, I assume that should be almost 100%. A fully online course, a blended or hybrid course, and finally a MOOC. So let's see what kind of results we have coming in here. Yes, I see face-to-face courses are at over 90%, and I see fully online courses and blended courses are about 20%, 21%. This is interesting for me to see. I'm not surprised by this at all, but it gives all of us a good idea about who's participating in this webinar today and what our background and experience is. Yeah, I see face-to-face now at about 92%. That's great. Okay, so let's go back and talk a little bit about motivation. So, okay, I'm sorry, I want to talk a little bit about course types and characteristics first. A face-to-face course is located in a classroom or a learning space. And in that context, interactions are synchronous. I understand that synchronous might be a new word for you, but synchronous means that it's happening in real time. Face-to-face communication is, there's no time lag, there's no time delay in face-to-face communication. And students and teachers, the numbers are limited in a face-to-face course. In a blended or hybrid course, it's partly in a classroom and partly online. And in this context, interactions can be both synchronous and asynchronous. So asynchronous implies that there is a time delay in the interaction. So that might happen through email, for example. You send an email off to an instructor, it comes back to you 4 hours later. That's an example of asynchronous communication. And that happens quite a bit in blended and hybrid courses. And again, the student and the teacher numbers are limited in this context. And often the online tools are there to support face-to-face learning. In a fully online course, there's no physical classroom space, and interactions can be both synchronous and asynchronous, and student and teacher numbers, again, are limited. And that's different from what I mentioned before about a MOOC. You know, it's a fully online course, again, with no physical classroom space. Most interactions in MOOCs are generally asynchronous, and with a MOOC, the number of students can be, the number of participants can be unlimited. Again, 5,000, 10,000, you can have really large numbers of participants in that type of course environment. Okay, so now having gone through the different course types and characteristics, I want to look at poll question number 2 and ask you to think about how would you describe the interactions in this American English webinar series? Think about all the aspects of the course that you're participating in. Would you say that our American English webinar series is mostly synchronous or mostly asynchronous or a little bit of both, asynchronous and synchronous, or neither? And I'm looking at responses here. It looks like a lot of people are saying C, both synchronous and asynchronous. Yeah, I've got over 80% here. That's great. I think I mostly agree with that. We have a name component that offers a discussion that happens in an asynchronous context. There's also a synchronous real-time chat happening right now. And I'm speaking to you live right now. So there is both a synchronous and asynchronous component to what we're doing with the American English webinar series. Okay, great. Let's go back then to talk a little bit about motivation now. When we think about different course types, it's important to think about both how and why we choose to participate. Traditionally, face-to-face courses have been associated with required learning. This is true for most young students going to school, for example. They don't really get much choice in the matter. On the other hand, many MOOCs are completely free and open to anyone. If you want to be involved, you must choose to participate. Think about your own motivation for a moment. How do you feel about participating in different types of courses? Let's have a look at one more poll question now to see. So poll question number 3, how do you feel about taking courses in general? I'm talking about all types of courses here. You, A, enjoy taking courses for your own personal benefit. B, taking courses helps me move ahead in my work and life, but I don't always enjoy it. And C, I only take courses when required to do so. So this is about what I expected. I see a little balance between A and B. Some of you are motivated for personal benefit and gain to take courses. And some of you do take courses for work and for life, but maybe you don't always enjoy them. And I think that's fair. That's true of a lot of people having to take courses. We don't always enjoy the courses that we have to take for work, for example. So we're at about 75% for A. That's great. Okay. So let me move ahead just quickly and talk about some very general advice for you, thinking about what course type is right for you. A couple things you should be sure to consider. You should consider your own level of motivation, and you should consider your own needs as a learner as well. And I think if you can think about these two things, they help you consider whether a fully online course, a MOOC, or a face-to-face course might be a better option for you. Great. Now I'm going to give us just a minute to pause and think. Please, I would like you to take 30 seconds and consider the following question that I'm going to put up here. And after 30 seconds have passed, I will ask you to type some of your responses into our chat. So again, I want you to pause for 30 seconds. For 30 seconds, you're not going to hear my voice. After 30 seconds, I'll come back and I'll ask you to type some of your responses into our chat. So here is our question. Please take 30 seconds, pause, think, and then we'll come back to see some of your responses. Okay, let's go ahead and type some of your responses into our chat now. If someone asked you for advice about being a successful student in an online course, what would you suggest? I see some interesting responses coming in here. I see patience, be patient. I agree with that. I see a lot of self-discipline. That's a great response. I agree with that as well. I see background and experience being important. Oh, these are really good ideas. I like to see this. Hard work. You need to be hardworking. Great. These are really wonderful suggestions. I appreciate this. Yeah, this looks very good. Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide now. And we're going to talk for the next several minutes about 7 different tips for successfully participating in online courses. How to be a good participant in the course. So tip number 1 will be review basic technical needs. Number 2, understand course objectives, tools, and requirements. Number 3, plan your time, and I saw that over in the chat. Number 4, plan to work both offline and online. Number 5, find an appropriate workspace. Number 6, develop a consistent routine. Number 7, create a peer support community. So these are all important, so let's talk about each one in turn, starting with tip number 1. Tip number 1 is to review the basic technical needs for the course. So for example, which OS, that stands for which operating system, and then are you working on a Mac or are you working on a PC? What are the requirements for the course? What will the course allow? Which browser? How do you get online? Does the course allow you to use Firefox or Chrome or Internet Explorer? Any of those? None of those? And then what type of devices are available for the course? Can you use your smartphone? Can you use a laptop? Can you use a tablet computer, a desktop computer? And what do you have access to? And what kind of software is necessary? Do you need Microsoft Word, for example, or something else? Many courses require specific types of software to participate. And video capabilities. Is video a required component of the course? Can you access YouTube? Some countries, YouTube is not available. This may be something you have to think about when you're considering an online course. And then social media as well. Many courses today have social media integration, so Facebook and Twitter. You might need to think about whether you're already participating, whether you're comfortable participating in those types of social media as well. So let me show you an example of one course and some sample technological requirements from that course. Here is a sample of some of the technical requirements listed for an online course at Belhaven College. So let me just highlight a couple of things here. You can see in the top right, I've circled the operating system, the OS. That's working with a Mac computer. They require 10.7 or better. So this is something you need to know about your own system, your own computer. And on the bottom, on the left, talking about different required software and the browsers, you can see the most recent version of the following: Chrome, Firefox, or Internet Explorer. All 3 of those are supported by this course. And then looking at a Mac, what kind of software do you need? MS Office, Microsoft Office 2011 or newer. That's pretty current. So again, this is something you need to know about your own system that you're using and whether or not you can meet the technical requirements of the course. All right, let's move on. Look at tip number 2. Understand course objectives, tools, and requirements. So here we can see a menu of options taken from a fully online course that I taught previously. You can see several options are highlighted here. I'd like to take just a moment to talk about each of these in case maybe you have never been involved in an online course before. So most courses, both online and offline courses, have some general course information and related course documents. These might be a course syllabus, for example, rating requirements, or instructions for how to participate in the course. In this course, you can see these listed in course information and course documents. Most online courses operate on a weekly basis. Each week will have 1 or 2 discussions, usually an assignment or task to complete, and a series of readings or resources to view. In my course, this information was listed under weekly assignments. Most online courses also have a discussion, and in my courses, there were usually 2 discussions that happened during each week. So if you want to see what a discussion looks like, let me show you an example on the next slide. Here you can see what a typical online discussion looks like. This might look familiar to you. This was taken from our name, You have the name of the participants listed very clearly, and you also have a place where you can click reply to respond to the posts. These types of discussions happen in most all online courses. And later on today, Jennifer will talk to you about how to specifically look at discussions and also how to grade discussions as well. All right, so let's move on to tip number 3, planning your time. Most MOOCs and other online courses give you specific information about time requirements and expectations for work. It's very important that you consider these when you're thinking about participating in a course. This is an example of a MOOC offered by edX on learning basic Chinese, and you can see the time expectations listed. You can see, for example, the length of the course is 6 weeks. The amount of effort is 4 hours per week. So I think it's important that you know the total number of weeks, you know the teacher's expectations for hours per week, and that you plan a weekly schedule according to when you will be available. So planning your time is really important, I think. All right, let's move on and look at tip number 4. Plan to work both online and off. So to think about working online and off, I'd like to ask a question for our discussion. What do you think you can do as a participant in an online course if you have limited access to the internet? How can you fully take advantage of time spent both online and off? So let's open that up for some answers in the chat. What can you do as a participant to take advantage of the online and offline time? All right, great. I see some interesting comments coming in. I see people talking about doing the readings offline. I think that's a great tip. I see people saying that you should carefully make plans in advance, some different things that you should focus on. Okay, these are all great tips. Let me give you a couple of my own as well. One idea is to download and print readings to do offline, and I saw this in our discussion just now. It's nice if a course gives you the option to download materials, print materials to read when you're not online. Take screenshots of instructions and online materials to review later. If you know how to take a screenshot with your computer, you can copy the instructions so that you can look at those later on. And also focus your online time on participating in the discussions. And I think that's really important. The best way to take advantage of your time online is to focus on looking at discussions and being a participant in the discussions. Okay, great. Let's move on and look at tip number 5 now. Find an appropriate workspace. In my own experience as both a teacher and a student of online courses, the space you are working in really matters. One thing that is nice about online learning is that you can be flexible in terms of where you study. And that's great. However, just like a face-to-face course, if you have a study and workspace that is consistent and organized in a way that you're happy with, then you can increase your chances of success. So I know that we all work differently. You need to think about what your preferred workspace is and find a space that works for you and try to be consistent with that space. It's really helpful to work in the same space, I think, if that's possible. All right, now I'm going to ask us once again to pause and think for a moment. So again, we're going to take 30 seconds to stop, take a short break, think a little bit about these 3 questions, and then after 30 seconds, I will ask you to type some of your responses to these 3 questions into our discussion. So take 30 seconds, please. You won't hear my voice, and then I'll come back to you and ask you to respond in 30 seconds. About 30 seconds. So let's go ahead and type some of your responses to these 3 questions into the discussion. Are you a morning or a night person? What time of day do you work best? And when will you be free from distractions each day? I see a lot of people saying morning person, morning person, morning person. That's great. I am too. I work much better in the morning. Well, there's a few night people in here as well. Some people saying they work better at midnight. I certainly don't, but okay. This is a very personal decision that you make about your best optimal work time. But again, my main point here is that you need to think about a time when you will be free from distractions each day. Great, let's move on now and talk about our next tip. Tip number 6 is to develop a consistent routine. I mentioned before that working from a consistent space can be helpful. When we talk about consistency, there are a few other points that can be helpful as well. So, plan a time each day to work on the course. Log into the course site at least 3 times per week. That's important. Why would you need to do that? Well, things change in an online course throughout the week, especially the discussions tend to evolve and change throughout the week. There will be new discussion threads that you need to respond to. There may be new instructions from the instructor that you need to see and to respond to. So it's important throughout the week to log in multiple times. And as an instructor, I found that 3 times a week is really a good choice, I think.
Yes, I completely agree.
Consistently check the course site and email for updates. And again, this relates to logging in on a regular basis. Check your email if your instructor is using email for the course, and also look at the course updates on a regular basis so you can see as things change and adapt in the course. Okay, move on to final tip, tip number 7, create a peer support community. Social networks can be helpful in developing peer support communities. In my experience, teaching online courses, I find that participants often want to create Facebook groups or connect with others in some kind of instant messaging service. That's great. As an instructor, I really support that. I think that's wonderful and helpful. So connecting with peers can facilitate learning, connect with participants through social media, like I mentioned, set up course support pages on Facebook, and sometimes this is something you need to do on your own as a participant in the course. It's not always instructor-led. Use in-course discussions to interact with others, maybe socially as well. That's great. Many instructors support that. And then reach out to your instructors as needed. If you have questions, instructors are often available via email or via in-course chat options. So reaching out to the instructor is important, I think. Okay, now to wrap up my section, I'd like to give you some tips from my own personal experience. I have been an online instructor for several years, and I've noticed several things that successful participants tend to do in my courses. So let me look at a few of these. One is something I've already mentioned, logging in several times throughout the week. I mention this again because it's something that not all students and participants automatically think about. I've seen a lot of people log in only once a week, and then gradually throughout 4 or 5 weeks, they start to fade out of the course because they're not able to engage as fully in the material. So please try to log in several times throughout the week if you can. I think that's really important. Ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. This is a really key tip, I think. Ask the instructor. But before you ask the instructor, ask your colleagues, ask your other participants in the course. Many courses have discussion forums specifically set up for answering student and participant questions. So when you don't understand something, just ask. If you're in a MOOC with 5,000 people, there's probably several other people who have exactly the same question you have. So don't be shy about asking.
I think that's very important. Good point.
Next. Reply early to discussion questions to get more feedback. And again, this is something that without experience, you might not have thought about as a participant in an online course. If you would like to get a lot of responses to a post that you make in a discussion, for example, it's really helpful to make your reply early on in the week, shortly after the discussion questions are posted by the instructor. This means more eyes will see your post, more people will think about what you have said, and more people will respond to you as well. So if you can, reply early to discussion questions to get more feedback and more response from others. And finally, fully explore all of the features of the course. This is a mistake I've seen many participants make in my own courses. They just don't get into the course and look around, look at different places where they can find help, where they can get support, where they can see instructions. So it's very important in the first week, in the first few days of the course, get into the course site, explore everything as fully as you can. Understand where you can see all of the instructions and materials for the course. Okay, now I would like to hand things over to Jennifer, and she is going to talk a little bit more about what instructors can do to make sure students and participants are fully engaged in their courses.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everybody. As Andy said, I'm here to switch the focus now from being a student to being an instructor in an online course. And those of you in the poll at the beginning of this webinar indicated, or many of you indicated, that you were very interested in taking or teaching an online course, but many of you hadn't actually taught an online course yet. And I hope that you can remember this information for in the future when you have the opportunity to do so. And I also want you to keep in mind today that this is also important information for face-to-face classes too. So what we do online isn't just for online. We can do it in the face-to-face classroom also. To start us off, I'd like to ask you a question today in a poll. So as a learner, when you have a deadline to meet, which best describes you? Do you complete the work a number of days before the deadline, a few minutes before the deadline, or sometimes after the deadline? So it looks like most of us, as good students, good learners, and good teachers, are saying that, of course, we complete it a number of days before the deadline. Okay, great. I'd like to go back to the presentation now. Okay, and I'd like to share with you some ideas on how we can make that happen in, oops, something's happening with my PowerPoint here. I'd like to share with you some ideas on how we can make that happen in our online courses. Throughout my years as an online instructor, many of the students tend to wait until the last minute to post their work. And that is problematic because it doesn't allow for much feedback from other learners or the instructor. And so one way to combat that or help with that in online classes is to have some assignments due at midweek and the rest of the assignments due at the end of the week. So essentially, you're making 2 deadlines for a week's worth of material. I suggest keeping these deadlines very firm and not having them be flexible, because this keeps all learners discussing the same issues in the same time period. Okay, we're going to move on to tip number 2. I wanted to say that this also spreads out the grading for the instructors when you have these midweek deadlines. It also avoids procrastination by the learners, and it allows for more formative feedback by the peers and instructors. And by formative feedback, I mean the feedback that we give to learners that's not scored. The purpose of that feedback is to suggest ways that the learners can improve before they're scored. So it's essentially like informed practice for the learners. And I'm going to talk about formative feedback quite a bit in the upcoming slides. So keep that term in mind, formative feedback. Okay, moving on to tip number 2, I wanted to say that to regulate your instructor feedback and input in online courses is very important. As instructors, it's often very common for us to want to be part of the discussions all the time. We could spend all day, every day, giving feedback to learners on a course because there's no time limit. But we need to make sure that we regulate that timing and the amount of feedback that we give for a few reasons. First, it allows the learners to work together and to negotiate the meanings, and they use that language for a purpose. They give each other feedback, and that feedback is at a similar level of input for them. So their language level is really helping each other instead of an instructor coming in with a higher level of language maybe. And also, when an instructor jumps in to a conversation, they often make it stop. Think about it in a face-to-face classroom when you are listening to a group discussing. If the instructor comes in and makes a comment to that group, oftentimes the learners just look to the instructor and stop talking. And that's not really what we want them to do. We want them to keep discussing with each other. And this is true in online situations too. As an online instructor, I always try to let the learners participate with each other before I jump into the discussion. So, immediate feedback from an instructor is not necessarily a positive thing in an online class. I want you to try, and I encourage you to allow the learners to respond first if possible, and then you can agree or disagree with what they've posted. Okay, we're going to move on to the next example of what I mean by regulate instructor feedback and input. And what I mean by that is that in face-to-face classes, if learners are off track, we might stop the whole class or wait until the end of an activity and then give them feedback or clarification to the whole group. And this would help students by not hurting their self-esteem. Since we're trying to address the whole group as a whole and get them back on track in an anonymous way, it really saves their face. It helps them keep their self-esteem up. In online courses, we can do the same thing by posting a message to the discussion board that everybody can see, but not addressing that post to a specific person. We could also address problems to a specific person, but do it very carefully and respectfully by pointing out the good points of their work first and then asking clarification questions to guide those learners back on the right track. And so I would encourage you to always include one or more positive statements along with your question or clarification when learners are off track or having issues. And I want to show you an example of the language I mean for that. So here is an example of a respectful response that I would possibly post when someone was a little bit off track in an online course. Hi, Nestor, thanks for posting. I like how you've clearly explained why. Nicely done. But I have a question about X, though. What did you mean when you wrote blah, blah, blah? When you have time, could you clarify that for me? And so in this way, I'm asking for the learner to explain their reasoning or possibly change their answer. And I'm doing this in a respectful way that could guide the learner back on track. And another way to help learners engage successfully is to use email, but to use it sparingly. And when I mean use it sparingly, I mean that we shouldn't use email for the bulk of our course, but we should use it to check up on specific learners who might be having some problems, or possibly to give a weekly summary of what's to come and how it ties into the previous lesson. But I would encourage you to use email only in these ways and encourage the learners in your course to only use email to ask personal questions, maybe regarding grades or something about them being absent. But all other questions and communication, I would encourage you to post on the learning management system, on the discussion board, so that all others can benefit from seeing those answers too. Okay, we have another poll question, and this poll question is about when you give formative feedback in your class. Okay, there we go. When you give formative feedback during your class, what do you usually do? Do you focus on the learners who are almost always successful and congratulate them on a job well done? Do you focus on the learners who almost always struggle and give them extra guidance? Do you focus on giving formative feedback to all learners? Or do you focus on giving formative feedback to all learners and have a method for ensuring that you do not only focus on the same learners over and over again? I see it's quite a mixed bunch of answers here. It's pretty well dispersed. Okay, so by looking at this, I can see that some people are doing D, and D is what I would really encourage you to do in your courses. We say, and we may have good intentions for spreading our feedback around to all the learners in the course, but we may not have a way to actually keep track of how we're doing that. Okay, I'm going to move back to the presentation now. And one way that we can keep track of spreading our comments around and not just commenting on the same people's posts each week is to use a spreadsheet with all the learners' names on it and just check it off as you reply to their posts during the week. You could use a physical paper, you could use this in digital form, you could possibly go in alphabetical order and post your replies to people. But just keeping track of who you're posting to will really help spread your comments around. Because again, we might have good intentions of doing so, but in reality, that doesn't always seem to be the case. Okay, we're gonna move on to our next poll. And this poll is about using groups. So in your current context, how often do you have your learners work in small groups of 3 to 6 people? Do you almost always, usually, occasionally, or never? And it looks like people have good intentions of using groups. So either usually or almost always. Those are the most popular answers. Great. So if you haven't used groups in your course, either face-to-face or online, I would really encourage you to try it. Even in situations where you have a huge number of learners in your course, and in fact, it might be even more important to try to do group work in those situations. And we're gonna talk about that now, considering using groups. Groups can be made in online environments too, not just in face-to-face classes. And they're usually created by using the built-in feature of the learning management system. It can be really helpful to have groups when you're doing project work because they can give each other peer feedback on the project, and then they can partner up with another group, and that group can give feedback to the other group, and it just creates a tighter community online. Also, groups can be really helpful just for a normal discussion online because the learners are working closely with a small number of people, and then they can usually dive deeper into a topic when it's just a few people in the discussion. So again, if you're going to create groups online, I would suggest groups of 3 to 6 people. 4 is ideal, and you might even want to change them up every week if possible. You might want to focus on balancing eager learners with more reluctant ones when you're forming your groups. And of course, you could also still have whole class activities and discussions too. It doesn't mean that everything has to be group work. Okay, the last tip that I want to share with you today is to plan for engagement from the beginning of your course. And one way to do that is to give examples of effective and non-effective participation and refer to that when you are giving your scores. And these scores here are for the participants in my online course that was a teacher training course. And so, of course, you could adapt these point values for your learners or develop your own, but the point is that they're very clear for you and clear for your learners also. And so you can see the maximum amount of points available for my online teacher training course was 5 points in a discussion. And that meant that they exceeded standards, they linked to what others had said, and they offered more information or ideas. And they were clear, concise, and they furthered the discussion with their posts in the discussion board. And I have some examples to show you of what these point values might actually look like. So first of all, we have here would be a 1 point example. And you can see that this person was actually not really clearly linking to the topic, and they may not have posted on time, or they may have copied their posts. Here's an example of what I mean by maybe a 3-point post. Notice that it's a bit longer. This person is maybe approaching the standard. They're not really offering new ideas or information to the discussion, but they are giving their own opinion about what's going on. They've signed it with their name and their country, and so they've done the basics, but they haven't really gotten to the exceeds category. They haven't really earned those 5 points yet. Here is someone who's earned those 5 points, who's exceeded the standard for what I expected. And this level of detail that I show the students, I give them these examples in the course so that they know what I expect. So here you can see this person is linking to what others have said in the discussion right here. So they're linking to these people who have already posted. They are giving examples of what they mean here. For an example, they are giving a link to more information where people can go and read about. And so they've really done a great job furthering discussion here with their posts. And so again, this level of detail is really important to show your learners in an online course so they know exactly what to expect. Okay. Now, this is a word that most people are really familiar with, especially teachers: plagiarism. So plagiarism is when we do not give credit for other people's ideas or other people's writing. And I would like to ask you a question. I would like you to raise your hand if you've ever had to deal with a learner who's plagiarized something for your class. I see lots and lots of hands going up. That's a lot of hands. Yes. So if you don't mind, go ahead and give me a quick example in the chat box of how you dealt with plagiarism in your class. Oh, I see many people saying constantly, yes. Does anyone have an idea of how they've dealt with it in their class? 0 points. Yes, that's a common thing. Call on students personally. Yes, good. Okay, so it looks like people have a lot of problem with plagiarism, and mostly people are deducting points for it. Okay, so I want to give you one idea that might help you in an online course of how to lessen the chances or maybe even avoid plagiarism altogether. And that is to ask the learners to apply skills or concepts covered in the class to their own context or situations. We don't want our learners to be copy machines. We definitely want our learners to have their own ideas and connect what they're learning to their life. And so if we can build that in from the very beginning of the course, it's going to cut down on plagiarism, and it's going to also help the learners remember what they are learning when they're connecting things to their own life. So for example, if you have a grammar exercise, maybe you could have your students write sentences using information about their classmates. They're not going to be able to get that online anywhere. They're not going to be able to copy that from someplace. So that's just one example of how you could cut down on plagiarism. Another example of how you can cut down on plagiarism is to move beyond asking simple questions to ask more complex tasks of your learners that require critical thinking. And these critical thinking tasks could be things like filling in a chart, sequencing some items, categorizing things, or possibly ranking. And in my online teacher training courses, I usually have about 25 learners in the course at a time. And with tasks like these that require critical thinking, I get about 300 meaningful posts per week. So these types of critical thinking activities are really generating a lot of meaningful conversation online. And I'm going to give you some quick examples of what I mean by each type of critical thinking idea here. So in this one, knowing the exact text here isn't important. What is important is that the learners take time to fill in these boxes with their own ideas. There's no correct answer here, and that's something that we talked about in the Ning discussion before the webinar. There's no correct answer here, but everybody is coming up with their own ideas about how to fill in this table, fill in this chart. And then they can compare their answers with other people in the course. This is also allowing them to critically think about their own context. And I, in the directions here, told learners that they could create their own column if they wanted to that pertain to their own context, and write their own ideas there. And that wouldn't allow them to compare with others, but it would allow them to think critically more about their situation. Okay, moving on to another example is you might want to have your students sequence items, and this provides your learners with a list of items, and then they provide their own rationale for why they sequence things the way they did. And again, this is applying critical thinking to a task. They could also categorize and rank items. So when they categorize items, they may be able to put them into two separate columns, and that might have a correct answer, but then the rationale for ranking items, most important to least important, might not have one correct answer. It might have many different answers, but their rationale behind their answer would be most important. Okay, I have one more idea on how we can plan for engagement from the beginning of a course, and that is to plan some surprise answers after the deadline has passed. So these answers would be opened only after the deadline for a discussion has passed, and it would allow learners to self-assess. It would allow learners to freely comment on each other's posts before the instructor jumped in, and it really limits the need for instructor input before the deadline in the discussion thread. So these surprise threads were really a hit in my class. They were really popular in my online course. And so that's just another way to think about engaging students in your course. I think we have come to an end with our time. And so I'm going to just wrap up briefly a summary of the tips for teaching online. There they are, the 4 tips that I talked about, and here are Andy's 9 tips that he talked about.
And I'll let you read these on the screen because we're just about finished with our time today.
Okay, Andy and I just want to thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the Ning discussion board. We are passing off the baton to you, and now it's your turn to run in this relay race of online learning and teaching.
Thank you all very much.